rates, but we shall see. So where we are, and I think it's a very exciting and wonderful place to be, is a situation where conservatism and radical transformation are walking hand in hand, and we want to extend that of course to the world of business. We know post-crash that much of what transpired was a result of what can only be called unethical behaviour. But we also know that the notion of ethical legislation seems ridiculous, seems out of step. Most of our regulators are utilitarian, they're formalistic, they don't concentrate on the spirit but rather the letter of the law. And the trouble is, with regulation that's not formed on the basis of ethics or character or value, regulation does nothing to change behaviour. And actually all that regulation does is essentially leave behaviour and character unreformed, and what clever people can do is always get around any regulation. What we seem incapable of doing as a society and as a business culture is creating conformity with the ethical vision and mission of what we do, and of creating a world where the incentives for realising such are real and play in. The only costs that we see at the moment are when bad behaviour is revealed and everybody says, you know, the costs are enormous, businesses crash, market value is lost. But curiously, in the marketplace itself, this seems to have no ongoing relevance. There's no real sense that many companies then take on the idea of having what one might call genuine ethos-driven mission statements that would protect them against bad behaviour. And we seem curiously blind to it. And part of that, I feel, is because we have no sense that we have a shared moral fabric anymore, that we have a sense that there's a clear moral goal that we should all pursue. And in the absence of that, it's very, very difficult to create the type of ethical business economy that, if you poll people, that's what most people want from their business and in terms of brand and value. And we know from the evidence, be it from employee share ownership or from mission-centred businesses, that actually ethics and profit walk hand in hand. Generally speaking, if you concentrate on just making excellent products, profits rise. But if you concentrate on making profits, your businesses tends to fail, tends to collapse, and tend to have a very short lifespan. Yet still, and this is something John Kay in particular has argued for, I think, very well, and yet still we're not able to fold this into any comprehensive business offer or way of behaving. One of the things that we at ResPublica have tried to do is challenge our current regulatory framework. We came up with the idea that bankers should swear an oath, which was laughed at by the industry and then subsequently adopted, which we like, and was recognised by the regulator, the CFA, who did a session with us and thought it was one of the most innovative ideas for changing behaviour. And the reason we like oaths is because they align people with the purpose of the organisation at the beginning, and people know when they break oaths, and people know when they cross lines, and we've created a world in which people don't know when they cross lines. And if we can restore those lines and restore the sense of purpose-driven, mission-driven businesses, this will be better for profit. There's places at the front, we've been saving them for you because we have foresight. And you also create an economy that genuinely works for the welfare of all, which of course is what we believe in. The interesting thing is ResPublica has been making a number of interventions with the regulators. The regulators are listening. The last thing we did, I think, where I argued lawyers should have compulsory pro bono attached to becoming a profession, which wasn't popular and we were denounced by lawyers, which again I enjoyed. And I had a good conversation with Michael Gove about it. And then is that actually, if we can restore the professions, and we've seen what's happened to the professions in health, and also I would argue in teaching, to the vision of what they ought to do, and people accept that, and we can start to regulate for that, so that we can create worlds in which people in professions who think behaviour is unacceptable, so that they can exclude people from those professions. We can also do it for businesses, and we need to create a world in which bad business, if you like, is crowded out by good business. The thing that always strikes me is you ask most people, their big choices are simple ones. Take, for example, they want a vivid high street, but they always shop in supermarkets. We don't have a way to realise of the big choices we'd like to make. We'd all like ethical businesses that don't rip us off. And we don't have a way of selecting, consumers don't have a way of selecting for the businesses and the business outcomes that they want. And if they did, then I think we would go a long way to demand crowding out bad businesses. At the moment, what we have is a business mixture that has too much rent seeking, too much playing by the rules but still being able to rip people off, so there's something wrong with our rules. And we have essentially unethical behaviour that isn't dedicated to the total welfare, if I can use awful economist speak, of the consumers. So what I'm interested in is having a radical debate that recognises regulation isn't really working, that recognises we need to reconnect the big wishes of consumers with individual small consumer decisions, that looks at the role of supply and how regulators might regulate supply, and how we can create good business. I think conservatism is right, that the only way to tackle poverty isn't through welfare, it's through ownership. It's through business. Business is the greatest redistributive mechanism because it starts before redistribution. It starts with assets themselves, people's abilities and their businesses and breakthrough activities that hopefully then can secure people and their families. So unless we can get business to work, the whole conservative model doesn't work. And that, I think, is the issue. And if the whole conservative model doesn't work, what it empowers is people who are screaming outside the conference. We then are there with an authoritarian state, a redistributive state. We then create a world where people want not to own because actually the kind of welfare supplements that are generated for them are enough. And we divide society in a way we shouldn't divide society. And that, I think, and we make capitalism the province of the already wealthy, which will keep them wealthy and ensure others aren't. So these are big issues. So rather than being vague, what I think these are is these are a touchstone point. Unless we can create a model of business and exchange that's ethical, our model of business and exchange is at risk. Without further ado, and you can tell I'm interested in it, so I apologise to colleagues on the panel for talking too much. Let us begin. I'll introduce each member of the panel before we begin, rather than all at the same time. But what I'd like to do is ask Fiona Bruce, MP for Congleton, to begin the debate. And it's a great pleasure to have you here, Fiona. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Philip, for inviting me. I have to admit, when Philip invited me to speak, I thought it was a fraud because I saw that the title involved being a global leader. Well, my background is very much running a community law firm, and I feel a double fraud because I'm a lawyer, and you've just been denigrating lawyers.
Not all, but some.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me, Philip. So I just want to talk to you about my own experience of running a community law firm for nearly 30 years, and I've looked particularly at the part of your title which says virtue in business. I really want to analyse, is it possible to do good in society whilst doing well in business? Well, let me start off by saying we all know that a firm's most important asset is its people, and that when most people leave a job, they don't actually leave the job, they leave their manager. Poor management costs business hugely in staff turnover, and it's, I believe, one of the most avoidable costs in a business. How to avoid it? Well, people, most surprisingly, they don't actually go to work just for a pay packet. It is important to pay staff well, but actually it's also important to give them, I believe, a reason, a vision to come to work other than the pay packet, because there'll always be a competitor who can pay them more. I left the city firm that I'd been a partner in for a trainee and a partner in for 9 years to set up a community law firm, because I wanted to have a firm that wasn't just interested in maximising the pounds that could be extracted from a client, but actually wanted to ensure that we treated clients and staff fairly, as we did a good legal job. And so what's happened over the years is that I've found that as I've worked at that, that vision has developed, and I thought I'd just share with you some of the ways that it developed, so that you could perhaps take some ideas away from a very small business. We're not a global leader, but I think we are an exemplar of a small business. And let's face it, nearly 100% of businesses are, very, very few businesses are global leaders. So it's about sharing a vision with the staff. And so I decided that we would try and do justice in the way that we did our work, tackle injustice, and tackle it locally in our community, not just by doing our legal work, but also more broadly, and also have a look if we couldn't, in some way, make a contribution by tackling it globally. So I just want to give you some examples of what the firm has done over the years. We've had staff who've helped build a school in Ethiopia, another one who's been a trustee for an orphanage in Honduras. We supported a school in Tanzania for over 10 years. It's grown from a handful of children to over 400. Medical centre in Uganda, staff have taught English in China, worked with street kids in Eastern Europe, funded pavement kids through school in India, taught computer skills to African children, and countless other projects over 3 decades that I now can't remember all of them, but I believe they will have made a big difference to many lives. Closer to home, we do prison visiting. We funded the start of the Cadet Advice Centre. We have a number of staff who have been school governors, member of staff who's helped secure the local library when it was closing. I've got my hands dirty painting railings with young offenders, laying a footpath with them, renovating public gardens. We've set out rough with rough sleepers. We've hung out with street kids. We've worked with the Message Trust, who are here. They have a stand here, work in some of our roughest parts of the country with some of the neediest kids. And I'm very pleased to say, also Philip, that over 25 years we've run a pro bono free legal advice centre every Monday.
I want to be clear that what I'm suggesting is that other lawyers learn from you.
Oh, thank you.
No, I mean it seriously. Well, the very fact that you're delivering this, I think, creates a high bar. What I'm interested in is how can we persuade and ensure that others follow your track rather than just ignore. That's what interests.
I actually think it's really easy because, as I say, people don't just want to go to work for a pay pack. You've got to pay a decent pay pack. But if you give them something extra in their working life, they will buy into it. People want to make a positive difference. So every young lawyer who's interviewed in our firm, we tell them about the Free Legal Advice Clinic, and we say every lawyer in our firm does or has contributed to it. And they have no problem at all with that. So in fact we've now, I think we've run that one for 25 years, we're in the second one now for about 8 years. And these are in some of the most deprived areas where our firm works. I think we've over the years given advice to thousands of people, over tens of thousands of hours. And I'm very pleased to say yes, and I say it, because I'm proud of my staff, that we have won Law Society awards as a result of this. So I think it's quite possible as a small firm to make a difference. So what am I saying? How can other businesses engage staff in this way? Because you might think, well, okay, you're a law firm, you can do this, and maybe you can release staff for time, and there are things that you can do. But actually, I believe there is something that every business can get involved in. And I've put on your chairs, or your colleague did, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think most of you will have these. These were announced in the US last week. I was privileged to be there as a member of the International Development Select Committee. There were global leaders representing 193 countries, because these have been agreed by 193 countries. There are 17 goals, and they're going to be applicable over 15 years. And the purpose of these goals, and you can see many of them are very wide-ranging, is to actually eliminate extreme poverty over the next 15 years, but also to reduce inequality in any country and to improve opportunity in any country. And one of the things that came out very clearly from the sessions that we attended there at the UN was this is not going to happen unless the private sector gets involved. You can have governments donating money, you can have recipient countries, you can have NGOs, but without the private sector, this is simply not going to happen. These Sustainable Development Goals are a call to action for business to get involved to help change the world for the better. And they're great guidelines. You know, someone said the private sector will lift a lot more people out of poverty than Oxfam ever will. I'm not knocking Oxfam, but it's true. I remember Digby Jones saying when he was head of the CBI, without taxes, without business there are no taxes, and without taxes there are no schools or hospitals. And that's just as true here as it is in the developing world. And so the private sector, I believe, has a massive opportunity to inspire its staff. It's not already engaged in some kind of corporate visionary exercise to actually get behind these goals. Big businesses are doing it. Unilever, for example, is leading the way. It's improving housing and working conditions for their workers in Africa. Big electrical companies are getting behind the project Power Africa, working with DFID and with donor countries to actually produce electricity for not just homes, but businesses there to provide job opportunities. I've been out there in Tanzania, seen a seed company which is producing seeds. Now it's a corporate enterprise, but it's teamed up now with a charity which is supplying motorbikes so that the motorbikes can get those seeds not just to the immediate areas but to the distant villages. I think there are fantastic opportunities for businesses locally as well as globally. Let me give you just one example close to home and then I'll be quiet. But as you can see, I'm quite passionate about this. Timpson's shoe shops.
Yeah.
When you go into a Timpson shop, you probably will not realise that you are being served by someone who is serving a sentence. But across the country now, there are and have been hundreds of people who have served time who are now working in Timpson's. 2 of the shops are managed by serving offenders. Fantastic opportunity, I think, that many other companies could take as an example of doing good whilst doing well in business. Timpson's, as we all know now, anyone who's watched John Timpson and the way the business has taken off in the last few years, is a very successful business. It's a quality operation. I'm not saying that just because my colleague Edward Timpson is MP for Crewe Nantwich, next door to me. So just to conclude, virtue in business, is it possible? Is it possible to be good, to be successful, and to do good at the same time? Yes, if you can align your corporate and social objectives, as my law firm does in a very modest way, tackling injustice in our community and the wider community, then I believe it's absolutely possible to do good, to do well, and to really succeed in business.
Thank you, Fiona. I found that very moving and wonderful story of your own work. I mean, and you know, let me say again, you know, there are many good lawyers who give an awful lot to their communities, but there are many that are not and who ignore it entirely. The question here's the question in the note: how do we persuade those that don't to do? And let me say it in another way. And this issue is, I think, true for all business. So if we look at something like Timpson's and then look at kind of one of the ideas I've long argued for, devolution, what I would like there to be, and hopefully with the Chancellor's move now, is cut businesses that contribute social value. Because business rates, not cut businesses, you understand. If we could reduce the business rate burden for those that add social value, this would be remarkable. Now, I don't think it should be so extreme that we just have charity shops in our town centres and bookies, which is the unpleasant mix we've got now. But what we certainly should do is those that are social value businesses that add goods that are external to the business should be rewarded. So in terms of the makeup of our new devolved economy, that would be one policy idea in which we could incentivise the outcome we want and encourage others to join it. What I'm interested in is how we can incentivise the outcome we want in all areas of business. So in law, for instance, we want the regulator to impose some ethical requirements given that law is a profession that has been upheld by hundreds of people, it's a profession with a social purpose, and we don't think anyone should trade on that without contributing to that social purpose. So there's a regulatory possibility there, that can we rewrite the regulations and get the regulator to have something other than make formal rule following? I don't know, but I think one thing might be is to restore the ability for training and licensing to the Law Society away from the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, for instance. So in each point and in each discipline, that's what I'm going to ask colleagues to comment on. Because I think if we can create the market-based incentives that reward the type of outcome that we want, we close the gap between what people want and what they have. And that, I think, is what we need to do. But I was very moved by that, Fiona. I didn't realise the extent of the work you're doing, which is fabulous. Next up, we have Andrew Cumpsty, Senior Counsel at JBP. Andrew, pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much. And over to you. We look forward to hearing your insights.
Well, thank you, Philip. I'm not sure whether I'm going to move you, but I shall try my very best. I've been coming to party conference at the Conservative Party since about 1863. I have chaired hundreds and hundreds of meetings like this, wearing my hat as chairman of Enterprise Forum. This is my first time ever on a panel, so I feel very free, and I'm going to be very challenging. And I'm going to challenge, first of all, ResPublica, because you've got the wrong title. It says here, Restoring the UK as a global leader in business culture. I think the title should be Maintaining and Building on the UK as a global leader in business culture, because the UK is, in fact, a leader. And I know that because I have had the fortune to travel around the world, and it's always fascinating to me to see how the world views Britain, and it's always a lot more positive and a lot more upbeat than in forums like this. So I think challenging, first of all, the title is extremely important. There is a massive desire to be like we in Britain, from areas like Africa, Asia, and the United States, where I've been fortunate enough to do business. There's also a huge history out there as well. You talk about shared values, and the Commonwealth particularly is huge in that. I did a lot of work in Malaysia, where not only do they have a desire to be like us, they have a very similar legal system, business system, parliamentary system, so huge shared values, and also they have a desire to use the skills and abilities and standards that we have in Britain to help them and their young people. And when I was in Malaysia, I did a lot of work with the government there on an area in the south of Malaysia called Iskandar Malaysia, which is about the size of Wales, and they were looking to grow and enhance and improve that area, and as part of that, they were looking to create a brand new university with 12 campuses. And they'd gone around the world looking for the best in all the fields, and in that area they've got Newcastle University out there doing medicine. You didn't mention earlier, but I used to be the leader of Reading Borough Council for the Conservatives, and so I saw this happening and managed to put their Chief Executive in touch with the Vice Chancellor of Reading, and now Reading have a university campus out there. So I saw out there the real passion that people have to learn from Britain.
Let me ask you a question.
No, let me finish first. I therefore think there is that desire out there, but we can never be complacent. We need to do much more, which is what I'm going to come on to. Mr. Chairman, over to you.
No. I mean, it's just when people make interesting points, I think it's interesting to intervene. I think you're completely right about Britain. Britain has a culture that is anti-corruption, which I think is our greatest business asset. You know, I work a lot in Eastern Europe, I work a lot in cultures where corruption is the norm, and it's endemic, and nothing can survive it. Let me ask you a question. Where did that culture that penalised corruption come from in our country? What was its origin? And can we learn from that to kind of push the ethical bar higher?
Where did that come from? Huge question. I think it came over time through democracy, through stability, and I'm going to come on to that. We have institutions here that are very stable, provide a very good background, I think, but also challenge. We are open, and you look at what has just happened with the automotive industry, Volkswagen, and before they're the banks. We are not afraid in this country to shine the light of truth and honesty on institutions. I think you're right. We do have a very strong democracy, and it appalls me as a past politician that we have such a low view of civic society in the country. There's a whole new, different area we could get onto, because I actually think, in comparison to the rest of the world, we're very good in the United Kingdom. But we've been through a very turbulent past, and if we were doing rebuilding, and civic society is a whole other area that we can look at. But just coming back to my speech, because I wrote it out, so I must deliver it.
No. You just said interesting things, and you're only yourself to blame for that.
I must write them down if I can remember what they were. But I think we do this going back to why has this happened through the power of culture in the widest possible sense. It was interesting when I was leader of Reading Council, we brought many businesses from abroad to the UK, and overwhelmingly outside of transport links, which was always the top driver. The other two were home life for their senior managers. Did we have a good quality of life, and the overall well-being of the community in which we were looking to invest. And we got Huawei and several others to come over and put their businesses in Reading. And that was important. And I do think also in that whole area of culture, we should never underestimate the power of sport and universities and that whole area. So I know when I went out to Malaysia, I mentioned Reading, and everybody knew where Reading was. And why was that? Because of Reading University and the fact that at the time Reading were in the Premier League, and everybody knew about Reading because of that. So that wider cultural issue, I think, is key. Just a couple of other points, and then I will be quiet. I think you mentioned legislation. I really do think this is not an area that we look to legislate. I think we've got it so wrong in so many areas. Look at the lobbying, for example, where if you're if you're working for a consultancy, you're nobbled. But if you're a trade union, if you're a charity, if you work in-house, you're not. So clearly there is a way to use legislation, but I don't think that it works particularly well in this area. CSR is another area that really interests me. You look at companies like John Lewis or Marks and Spencer, who have got that longevity and do it well. Legislate on CSR, you will get that classic box-ticking exercise, and it just doesn't work. It's a cultural change. Two final points. Stability is important. We might hear a lot about the long-term economic plan over the next few days, but as chairman of Enterprise Forum, I hear all the time, stability, dull stability, certainty is what businesses want. And if you create a culture where you have that certainty and growth and success, you also create the opportunity for businesses to take more risks, more decisions, and to be more creative. So I do think if we're looking to maintain and build on the UK as a global leader in that long-term economic plan actually is incredibly important. And the final thing is leadership. How did all this change? Well, we had great leaders, I think, in the past in business. Powerhouse, which is absolutely central to what the Chancellor is talking about. When you look at the great cities of Manchester and Liverpool and Newcastle, built by entrepreneurs, people who led in their area. And I think the whole LEP idea is interesting. I say that as a former deputy chairman of the LEP in the Thames Valley. I think we need to get the new business leaders, the young business leaders into that area so that they can be enterprising and take risks again. So those are my general thoughts. I think if we do all of that, we will continue into a future world and a generation that will constantly want to be like we are in Britain. And I think it's a great thing.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Much appreciated. I'm always very interested in the idea of culture change rather than institutional change, and they're always and often opposed. And yes, I think if you have one without the other, you tend not to get anywhere. And I actually, and I appreciate Andrew probably would disagree with me on this, I tend to think in order to get cultural change, you need institutional change. Otherwise, because institutions by their very nature are accreted products with enormous amounts often of vested interest in that. So I do think the two should often walk hand in hand, but I realise others have an allergy to institutional change, which I do understand. But anyway, perhaps Patrick might enlighten us. Patrick Woodman is Director of External Affairs at the Chartered Management Institute, the professional body for management and leadership. And if I could just thank CMI and commend them, they've been a visionary institution for years, talking about these ideas before anybody else. And we're enormously grateful at ResPublica that the CMI have partners with us on this event and made it possible. I would really ask you to see that they really are visionary on these issues. So let's hear what Patrick has to say. Patrick?
Like that leaves absolutely no room for disappointment.
Sorry.
My thanks to ResPublica for their help in doing this as well, and the challenge and ideas that Philip and the team come up with. I suppose from my perspective, this is fundamentally to do with an aspect of the fact that across British business and society, we tend to undervalue management and leadership. We don't invest enough in helping managers to develop the skills they need to succeed, and I think that feeds through into some of the failures that we've seen. Yes, Britain still has a reputation, an excellent reputation in many sectors, but I think we need to be honest about the impact of the crises in the financial services sector, of mis-selling, rate fixing. Our biggest and arguably best retailer has been hit by huge accounting scandals. It's not just about business, actually. You look at the failures in the public services as well, where poor management and leadership has seen purpose skewed into the wrong directions. So to put this in the broader context, I think Fiona kind of articulated very clearly that people leave bad managers, and in fact 43% of managers rate their own bosses as ineffective. Perhaps that's unsurprising. Only 1 in 5 are qualified in management and leadership. And actually managers are among the occupational groups least likely to be trained by their employers, which is somewhat counterintuitive. Now, these people can be technical experts, accountants or engineers very often, but they're accidental managers when it comes to that career progression, getting on. As a result, I think when you ask managers what the dominant leadership style is in their organisation, the top results are authoritarian, secretive and bureaucratic. These are not the recipes, the building blocks for ethical business cultures. We might note as well that it's kind of at the root of our productivity gaps to G7 competitors as well. I think that's probably another debate for another day. So given these problems, I suppose the question is, what does good look like? And we ran a commission with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Management and Leadership. Found that well-managed companies do 3 things very well, and some of those have already been touched on in the contributions so far. Purpose, people, and potential. So first, they do have that sense of social purpose. Beyond delivering quarterly results, this is what we as a company exist to achieve. Secondly, they look after their people, they develop them. And thirdly, they maximise the potential of the younger generation, but also for larger companies in particular in helping smaller organisations in their supply chains. We talked to the likes of Unilever, which has really integrated that sense of purpose into what it does and right across its range of brands. Paul Holman scrapped on his first day in the job, essentially scrapped their internal quarterly reporting to reduce that short-term pressure and allow them to focus on the long-term purpose that they identified. And I think you see this coming through in a lot of other discussions as well. We had Lord Brown, former Chief Executive of BP, at our offices last week talking about his new book, and he estimates that around 30% of the value of companies could be bound up in their relationships with society. But the risk is that corporate social responsibility, admirable though its aims are, becomes a Friday afternoon thing. You spend the rest of the week dealing with core business, and Friday afternoon you think about how we tick those boxes. His argument, I think, which one we absolutely endorse, is that it needs to be inherent in the core of how the organisation is managed. And that does need to have a shift in culture. I think for businesses it's perhaps less about institutional reform, that might be part of it, but it's also about leadership and setting the tone from the top, because I think culture exists in the interactions that happen within an organisation day to day between managers and employees, between teams, between senior leadership and investors, and the questions that are asked, the discussions that take place. And we've done research over the last couple of years with Moral DNA, looking at managers' ethics and how their ethical principles influence their decision-making in business. And the research shows that in general, people tend to leave their personal sense of ethics at the door when they come to work. Unfortunately, managers, that effect is even more pronounced. So people tend to kind of leave their kind of ethical care for others behind, and there's a greater emphasis on following rules. That, I think, runs a risk of what we call robotic compliance, where you follow the letter of rules rather than their spirit, where people don't take responsibility for making their own decisions. And I think that's kind of where it comes to this question of empowering staff, empowering managers.
Can I just ask you a question?
Right, I think that means I'd like to say something interesting.
Yeah, no. You've hit the high bar. And what was fascinating, I wanted to stop you on robotic compliance, because you then kind of switch to personal responsibility.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to me to be the answer, because surely the answer to box ticking and that sort of compliance is that most people, when you say to personal responsibility, they don't know what the right thing to do is. You know, if you look at companies that go into crisis, many of the time, as you yourself have pointed out and Petra's pointed out, managers don't know what the right thing to do is, and if they just go to themselves, well, subjectively you can endorse anything. There needs to be a presence of something objective here, and this is where I think the regulators have let us down. Is there any way in which you can see that kind of when managers are called to responsibility, they have a notion of a higher purpose? So it's part of the work we've been interested in is trying to give very clear, it's why kind of we like oaths and visions, very clear idea of what you ought to be doing versus what you are doing.
Yeah, I suppose I wouldn't reduce it to a question of regulation per se. I think it's something that needs to be owned by companies themselves, and that's about leadership fundamentally, about articulating the vision for the company, what it exists, and how each part of the business then contributes to that goal. And because I think you're right, if you have got, and this is I think the connection between compliance and personal responsibility, if you've got a sense of vision and you've got clear values across the company and understanding that's discussed and is lived about what the organisation is and does, then that's when you can ask people to take responsibility. If you were simply commanding and controlling,
you've created
then you take that away.
A shared vision together within about what this company is about.
Yeah,
and so people know what the good is.
Exactly, and we see it with even more strongly with the most recent report we published, which looked at employee-owned companies, and they come across very markedly different in terms of their leadership cultures. They're more than twice as likely to describe, when we survey people working in those companies, more than twice as likely to say that the management and leadership is democratic, it's involving people, it's consensual. It's, the flip side, in other organisations you've still got quite a high number of those who are command and control or pace setting, very directive. And so in those employee-owned companies, you've often got a more inherently democratic conversation about what the business does and a shared vision of how it moves forward, which I think is it's about giving people that voice and responsibility in the organisation.
Thank you.
So just to wrap up, I think the kind of points to take away from that would be around kind of first of all doing more to develop those management leadership skills from the outset. We don't have great roots into the profession. We do tend to have people who end up in the profession as accidental managers. We've been working with a number of employers and the government to develop a new standard for a trailblazer apprenticeship for management and leadership, which we're looking forward to launching later this autumn, which I think will be a very exciting movement, and there's a huge push obviously from the government on the skills agenda and the apprenticeship agenda in particular. So that's I think one kind of direction of travel. Secondly, I think perhaps more grandly it's about humanising and democratising the workplaces. We've been talking about empowering staff. I think that there could be talk about employee ownership. There may be scope for government to renew its enthusiasm for that agenda. We worked with Graham Nuttall on our research, who ran the government's review in 2012 on employee ownership. So whether that's in supporting transition of businesses into employee ownership, Grant Thornton I think is a very interesting example of a business that's moving in that direction at the moment. Or looking at public sector conversions as well, and we've talked to some there as well in our research. But I think also those lessons for managers in all sectors about the strength of company culture that you can take from the employee-owned sector. I think it also means increasing diversity in the top of British businesses. We've not talked vastly about that, but I think if we want to strengthen culture, having diversity of viewpoints so that you do get dissent and challenge and avoid groupthink is something that is to be welcomed. And a great way of doing that is transparency. And we've been very supportive of the government's moves on gender pay gap reporting, which some people may dislike as a way of regulating business, but I think it taps into an incentive which is around public reputation. Excuse me, because companies don't want to be seen in a negative light. They want to appeal to the widest number of people and future talent, and so I think that transparency piece is a really powerful way of driving some of the change we've been talking about.
Well, thank you very much. Lots of interesting stuff, but I better not interrupt you anymore. So thanks, Patrick. Lastly, we have Peter Holbrook, CEO of Social Enterprise UK. And Peter and his team have been instrumental in mainstreaming social enterprise in this country. And we'd really be interested, Peter, in your take on this virtue and market offer and what we can do to boost social enterprise again, outside of the old debates from 2010 around the Social Value Act. What's the next way we can push this agenda forward?
Well, I'll come to that, Philip, but I'll take a leaf out of your own book and never directly answer the question. I'll start by just reflecting a little bit on big society, because that might now be a term that's been consigned to history books, and it probably exited number 10 along with Steve Hilton back in 2012 or 2013. But in policy terms, that whole kind of agenda, which unfortunately was hijacked by the third sector in its more traditional form, the charity sector, and reduced it to a sense of purely around volunteering as a way of replacing cuts in public services, is actually very much alive and well if you look at the detail of public policy. And I think there's lots of reasons to be reasonably cheerful in this kind of space. Big society has become a bit like a geriatric distant relative that you put in a care home far, far away. But it still makes an occasional appearance. And there's plenty of ministers and MPs that go and visit it occasionally and find that it's actually still got an awful lot to offer. So it was referenced a lot in the Health and Social Care Act, and all health watches were set up as social businesses. The establishment of Big Society Capital, which was financed with £600 million of money back in 2012. You've got the creation of over 100 public service mutuals that have taken thousands and thousands of staff out of public sector institutions and put them into employee-owned social enterprises. Chris White MP, member for Leamington, the Social Value Act in 2012 that came live in 2013, the creation of social investment tax relief in 2014, the right to bid in the Localism Act of 2011, which gave communities the opportunity to run their own services and buy local buildings of local importance. And all of these arose under the last coalition government, but all were led by Conservative ministers and Conservative MPs. And then if you look at the current manifesto, you've got 3 days corporate volunteering in there. You said you'd like to get rights to employee ownership back on the agenda. Well, the right to mutualise is in the Conservative Party manifesto, so we should see a lot more of that. And there's a renewed commitment to SMEs, particularly in terms of providing a much more enhanced role in public service supply chains. And it's not just social enterprises, but obviously small businesses are at the heart of delivering social value in our communities. I have the privilege of running Social Enterprise UK, a membership body that proudly represents 70,000 of these businesses. And they are doing incredibly well. They are growing at an incredible rate of growth, outperforming the traditional private SME sector. So 60% grew last year, which is 20% more growth than we saw in the traditional SME sector. 40%, you mentioned diversity, 40% are led by women. And incredibly, half of all these businesses have been established in the last 5 years, according to the research we published with Santander. And you talk about leading the world. Well, this report handily is called Leading the World in Social Enterprise. And what it shows is that the UK has the most benign and positive policy environment for social enterprises to grow, and the world looks to the UK to understand what those policy drivers have been to help grow not just the world of social enterprise, but also social investment. And the Prime Minister launched in 2014 the G8 Social Investment Task Force during the presidency of the G8, which again has tried to create a much more benign environment for people wishing to invest in mixed motive businesses. So actually there's a lot to celebrate, and I think that we need to recognise that the UK is indeed leading the world in this revolution, and in many respects that the politicians are sometimes behind the public here. We're seeing a huge growth in community energy schemes right across the country. In the Prime Minister's own constituency in Witney, we've got a fantastic community energy scheme run as a social enterprise, putting solar for photovoltaics across all public buildings and providing income for schools and hospitals and community centres. There really is a boom, and unfortunately it's kind of hidden from sight for a whole variety of reasons. And it is something that we should celebrate, because increasingly we are seeing the market move in a very positive direction, where the market, consumers, graduate employers are being rewarded by doing the right thing. And we are seeing a whole new generation of businesses emerge that have either a mixed motive or a primary social purpose. And these businesses are growing very successfully. So the country's largest independent leisure provider is GLL. It span out as a public service mutual back in the 1990s, 1993, and today has a turnover of over £200 million. In fact, the sector has a total turnover of around 24 billion and employs over 1 million people. And these rates of growth have remained all the way through these difficult economic times, as has indeed John Lewis's growth. Whilst competitors have been really struggling, we've seen John Lewis continuing to build its market share, Waitrose continuing to build its market share, and the market rewards businesses that look after their suppliers, their staff, their local communities. And who wouldn't want to work for a business?
Can I just ask you, why do you think it does that? Why do you think the market, what is it that the market rewards? Where you say rewards those companies who support their suppliers, their employees, and so on. Why do you think consumers sense it, or do you think that the products are offered are better because of that? Because quality rather than price becomes the determinant? What is it?
I think if you can focus on long-term value rather than short-term quarterly reports, as has been said before, you actually create a better business model. And of course there's often less leak in the bucket. So you're not constantly having to cut costs in order to provide rapid shareholder returns. And if we look at those models, we see, for example, the co-owners of John Lewis continually choosing to invest in the long-term health of the business rather than take a quick dividend. And if you look at what's happened to ownership of shares in the last 20 or 30 years, I think 30 years ago the average period that someone held a share was 8 years. Today it's 6 months. And that does actually drive short-termist behaviours, and that does actually strip out value within businesses in the long term, and actually creates a house of cards, as we've seen with Southern Cross, for example, the care home business, where they stripped their assets, they sold their assets, inflated their profits in order to meet short-term shareholder interests, and then the whole thing collapsed, creating a huge mess for government to pick up. So I do think that it's almost the risk of capitalism eating itself, and we've seen not just Paul Polman, but a whole variety of business leaders come out and recognise this and say, you know what? We need a different relationship with society, we need a different relationship with our staff and our stakeholders, and actually that is in the best interests of the long-term future prosperity, not only of our business, but of the communities and the stakeholders on whom we rely. I used to work in the private sector, and actually someone mentioned Marks and Spencer's, and I worked there at a time when it went from being a majority family-owned business to a fully shareholder-owned business. And it was very rapid, the way in which costs were stripped out of that business. And employees that had been there for 25 years were exited and replaced by cheaper labour that did not have the relationship with loyal customers. And actually, that over that period, Marks and Spencer's got itself into a hell of a place. And really, since Plan A, it's only really been finding that relationship and rebuilding that relationship with its customers once again, and its fortunes have improved. So I absolutely believe that the short-termism might well enhance your short-term ability to pay out dividends, but damages the long-term sustainability and viability of the business.
Thank you.
I hadn't quite finished.
Oh, sorry.
Your
It was the turn of the page. So
I was just going to say a couple of
Carry
other
on.
things.
Sorry.
Where this has gone wrong, I think, is if you look, the government actually is still, and successive governments are pretty schizophrenic about this. So whilst we know that small businesses create huge value, employ the majority of people, public service markets are still heavily dominated by kind of oligopolist conditions and behaviours, cartels at worst, and we see that in energy, children's, residential care, banking, transport, welfare to work, transforming rehabilitation. It's actually at the odds with the very spirit of the free market, and indeed at odds with One Nation Tory ideals to see the markets being sewn up in these ways. And although the government has made consistent pledges about letting small businesses into the government supply chain, we really have seen very little movement. And actually we need to put social value, the Social Value Act, and extend that really into the heart of it. I'll give you an example. There's a great social enterprise called Triforces Recruitment, and there's another one called X-Forces. And these businesses go out of their way. They actually have a primary purpose to employ ex-service people coming back from combat. The cost of not dealing with this as an issue is vast and ongoing over many, many generations in terms of criminal justice, alcohol and drug dependency. Any way you cut it, it costs us as taxpayers vast amounts of money. Why not reward businesses that take on this burden and help rehabilitate ex-servicemen, not through the delivery of public services, but through employment? And we're beginning to see enlightened commissioners, local authority leaders start recognising that putting social value into commissioning and contracts is actually a really, really good way of reducing cost rather than trying to force businesses to do stuff they're not very good at. If you ask businesses to do this stuff, they're absolutely fantastic at doing it. And there are some great examples. People have mentioned Unilever, but Johnson & Johnson have a credo. You know the credo? As every member of staff walks into that building, into that head office, there is a huge granite slab that talks about its commitments to communities, to the environment, to society at large, and lastly to its shareholders. And that as a message as you walk into that building every day has a huge, huge impact. Waits as a family business have been doing this for years, Waits Construction in our communities. What we're moving towards, and Marks and Spencer's doing this and others are, is integrated reporting. The free market actually demands that we don't just judge businesses' performance on their financial returns alone. We have to get smart and savvy and reward businesses on a triple bottom line approach. And Marks and Spencer's have started doing this, and many other enlightened businesses, reporting their financial returns alongside their social and their environmental. And actually breathing transparency into business is absolutely part of the free market. It's the natural evolution of the free market. The free market isn't just about the right to choose or the right to provide services and goods. As a consumer, it's also about the right to know. And it's about being able to make an informed choice. And that's the same when government is spending money or the same when I'm spending money, which is why fair trade, organic, free range, all these ideas and social enterprise has captured the imagination of consumers right around the world. I'll leave it there, Philip.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me turn it over to the audience. I propose to take 3 questions, and what would really be interesting is what the audience thinks might work. What do you think might actually encourage this development such that it becomes the norm rather than at present? I don't think it is the norm. I think we like to kid ourselves it is, but I don't think it yet is. How can we get that? So, ladies and gentlemen, who would like to ask a question? So I'll take it. I've got 4, so I'm going to take all 4, and then I'll ask the panel to respond to the questions that they feel they would like to. So if you just identify yourself.
So I'm Tom Hadley from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. We're the professional body for the recruitment sector in the UK. I guess the 2 points I would make is I think a lot of this agenda has to be driven on a proactive, positive agenda. I think there is still a role for regulation. So the feedback we get from our members is we don't need more regulation, we need regulation, but crucially what we need is proper enforcement. So the biggest single gripe for our sector is regulations are out there, you're getting up, but you get undercut by people in their jobs market. And the reason it's a real challenge for us is because things are being cut. One of the things we don't want to see cut is government enforcement. So I think that's a really important point. The other driver for me is not just employers, it's the role of professional bodies. So our job is to raise standards and perceptions which we're judged on of our sector. So I think there's a really good opportunity to tap into that, not just through codes of practice, etc., which we drive, but also by driving a debate on the discipline you represent. So for us, it's recruitment. For Patrick, it's management. And I'd be interested to see, Patrick, are you seeing a change in the way that companies are recruiting? Because that's part of our campaign around good recruitment. Are people recruiting more on values rather than just skills experience? Because that would be a good sign, an interesting sign that businesses are really getting up to speed with this agenda, how you bring people in.
Thank you very much. The gentleman there.
Jonathan Jenkins from Social Investment Business. Peter, I agree with you that there's a shift, and the sector that I think is still dramatically behind it is the mainstream financial services industry. If you look at, in terms of short-termism, you look at Anthony Jenkins, who was explicitly trying to change the inherent value within Barclays, but he didn't turn it quick enough for his profits to return, so he went. And that, I think, was the single most depressing thing that I've come across in 5 years of social investment, was seeing the head of Barclays go, who was actually trying to change the culture. So is that going to change, and what can anybody do to help push that agenda?
A very good point, and thank you very much, sir.
I'm Steve, I'm from the University of Exeter Conservative Association. First of all, just want to say thank you to all 5 speakers for absolutely amazing either personal stories or great insights into their sectors. What I wanted to ask was, especially in the 21st century, especially post-crash, we've got a big focus on the financial sector. And when we've got businesses, when we've got, I think, flourishing businesses like business and tax avoidance, where you've got people almost training and preparing big multinationals how to avoid tax, you've got entire sectors that are rooted in vice already. And how would you approach businesses like that, businesses which, frankly, I do not see any redeeming quality in? How would you either regulate it away, or how would you try to change the culture of society to stop using these businesses to strive for asset? What would you do about this growing immorality in the financial sector?
Thank you very, very much. Sorry, I missed your first name?
Steve.
Thank you, Steve. I think a fantastic question there on how you shift clearly an explicit bad behaviour. So thank you. The gentleman behind you.
It goes back to that bad behaviour, and I think lots of the examples you've given today are clear bad examples, but let me give you a slightly more different one. I'm a house builder, and I aggressively expand into the green belt. Now, on the one thing, I'm doing a public good by allowing people to get onto the housing ladder, but for other people, that's destroying the countryside. And how do you define good when the public on some issues aren't necessarily consistent about what good is?
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'll ask the panel to reply in reverse order to those questions. So Peter, could we have you don't have to answer them all, but if you just answer the ones that strike you.
I mean, I think, transparency, isn't at odds with conservative ideals, actually. I think it's absolutely part of the free market, as I've said, and I think we have to kind of force or mandate much greater transparency, because I think when you breathe the oxygen of light onto bad behaviour, people actually shy away from continuing to do it. And I think if we can use the tax system, perhaps, Philip, to actually encourage transparency, there's a big movement coming from the States that's helping to do that, called the B Corps model. Ben & Jerry's and Patagonia and a whole variety of businesses have adopted this approach, which means that they respond to 200 questions which are then made publicly available on pay ratios, tax, health for workers, all sorts of stuff. And actually, that does for those businesses, they believe, give them a market advantage. Secondly, I think that I do think that there has come a point in kind of globalization and humanity where we have to reward and encourage businesses that put some social and environmental commitments into their fundamental rules of operation. So putting them into their MEMARTs and actually making explicit commitments, not just in the rhetoric of glossy CSR documents, but actually mainstreaming some commitments about how they are going to operate, the moral code that they're going to operate, a bit like Philip mentioned in terms of an oath, but why can't we actually put those into the rules of companies whereby they commit to operating within a moral framework rather than simply in a financial framework? So that would be the one thing for me, but I do think transparency has to be part of this solution. And even the Freedom of Information Act does not have many friends within any part of the political landscape, but we do need something similar. So when businesses are delivering public services or engaging with government, we need to be able to find out how they're operating, rather than leave it for the Public Accounts Committee to uncover posthumously what's been going on. And I also think far too often companies that have been outed for doing terrible, terrible things are then given more opportunities to win business and continue. So there is no disincentive in many cases to end bad behaviour, even when it is highlighted. And I think, government as a whole and the public sector as a whole could be and should be a much, much smarter customer.
I think fantastic. Thank you, Patrick.
Especially Tom's question about recruitment, I think that's a really important point, because if recruitment doesn't change and focuses on what employers are asking for, and they purely focus on the results, what you got, not how you got that, what corners did you have to cut to get there, then I think we end up in problems. And we saw quite mixed scores on that in our research. I think those employers who understand this agenda, who get it, are there. They're looking to recruit people who can live those values and live up to them throughout the course of their time with the company. I think that's quite important. But it also has to be replicated not just at the recruitment stage, but then at how those people are managed, performance managed throughout their work, so that it becomes about rewarding values-based behaviour, recognising that, not just what the numbers are, because they can badly skew behaviour. I thought the point about transparency is absolutely very well made, and that reporting piece. And what we see is there is some interest starting to come through from the investment community, which I think is a really important part of this, because if they're not asking to see that more integrated reporting, to see that transparency, then we won't get very far. You've got the likes of Helen Morrissey and the Investment Association now starting to look at what measures they would drive around human capital integrated reporting. I think that's very welcome and something we're looking forward to kind of feeding into. And I think that kind of wider public naming and shaming, I talked a little bit earlier about reputation, and I think that kind of naming and shaming thing can have an impact as well. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which kind of tracks trust in different parts of the economy, this year I think for the first time the tech sector dropped in that way, something that's had a pretty good reputation in general. One of the factors for that could be the sense that we've seen the likes of Google and Amazon and their names dragged through the mud, frankly, about their tax arrangements. I don't think that does companies any favours. So I think they're very sensitive to that, and that's a potential lever to drive some change.
Thank you so much indeed. Andrew?
Various there. The last question that touched on housing and all that whole area, there are lots of answers on the Localism Act, and it's really interesting. I've seen a lot of communities that have understood that their children need places to go and live, and they, through the Localism Act, have been able to go out there and through referendum locally change the community in which they exist. So I think there are opportunities out there. It's not being used greatly, but I think those cases, and in one particular in Buckinghamshire, have been really interesting because the community have taken hold of that. Difficult subjects that politicians quite often have found it difficult to come to an answer on because it's hard, and communities have through that actually solved the problem. On the financial sector, which was raised, two things I have to say on that. One, in terms of changing attitudes, I did some work with CBI because they were very concerned that the financial sector accounts for about 15% of GDP overall, so it's very important. And they were concerned of changing reputation. And I got involved with that and spoke to lots of people within that sector. And it did amaze me that still there was this entitlement around bonuses, and they really just haven't got it. And so there's some, I think, fundamental change that does need to happen around there. There have been inspirational leaders, you're entirely right, but the core around the financial sector needs fantastic change, and they're nowhere near it as yet. The other thing I'd say about the tax avoidance question that Steve was asking, but for my mind, I go back to the boring environment answer that I gave in my speech, which is if you have a stable economy, which is low tax, which is low regulation, actually all the evidence shows that more tax is taken. And actually if that tax is lower, there are less reasons to go out and try and avoid. So I think it's a win-win on that personally. And then the final question here, Tom was asking about regulation. One of my great heroes said, when the answer is more government, then you've asked the wrong question. And I genuinely do believe that. I'm interested to hear what people want to propose in terms of more legislation. But the amount of time one sees government intervene and get it fundamentally wrong and makes a bad situation much worse. So I am sceptical, but if there are options to...
It's not more regulation, I think it's effective enforcement of what's already there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lastly, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely believe this boils down to inspirational leadership. You can have all the regulation you want, but unless you have inspirational leaders, then it's not going to work. And so, Tom, at recruitment, get a really senior member of the business to inspire at that very moment when you're actually interviewing, when you're shortlisted, what your business is about, what its vision is, what kind of role people can play. To be passionate about it, and I think then you will raise the bar of performance amongst the people who you recruit. It's about inspiring, it's about being absolutely passionate, and no regulation can do that because it actually comes from here. I think that economic stability is absolutely critical if we're going to free up businesses to actually be able to do more than just strive to survive. And that's why government does play a role. But it's also why businesses have to, you have to take risks, but I think there are an awful lot of businesses from around April 2008 now who are very nervous about taking the kind of risks that could end them up if there's another situation like that in a flaky business position. And so it's very important that government does absolutely all it can to create this economically stable position whereby we can have the virtuous circle of stable business, staff retention, and be able to take the kind of risks that make a difference, plus add on your social contribution as well. So I think government does have a role, but I don't think it's through regulation. I do think shareholders have a role. I think that we need to do more to hold companies to account. We actually need to attend annual general meetings and actually say, what have you done in terms of your social contribution, your environmental contribution? We tend not to do that. We just leave it to the big pension funds or whoever to attend. And I think there needs to be a lot more active involvement about holding companies to account when they are holding our money. So those are really my key. House builders, sorry, I know you raised it. It's a really difficult tension.
And it's not just house builders. I mean, there's lots of other examples. It's just
there is a massive amount of brownfield land, and the government has recently put incentives in place to encourage builders to actually build on brownfield and not just on the greenfield sites that nobody locally wants to build on, but actually, of course, that's where people want to live.
I'm enormously grateful once again to CMI for letting this debate happen, and it really is central. It's central to the future we all want to inhabit, and I'm very conscious that we're not there yet, though we have enormous potential. We shall work more on it, and we look forward to working with our partners and our fellow speakers. Thank you all very much. If you're interested, an allied issue is we, together with a co-op, are releasing a paper that's been quite widely trailed at 5:45 tonight about increasing mass ownership, that I think will resonate strongly with the ideas. And come to our fringe tonight at 5:45 to hear that. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much, everybody. Round of applause.